So first, let's talk about WordPress. Like I said, it's the one that we're the most familiar with. Um, I've seen various stats where it's like over half of the web. And Bill and I were talking about it the other day, and it's we're pretty sure that it is over half of the websites that are in use in the United States are powered by WordPress. So it's a huge market share. And worldwide, the stat I found was about 40%. The reason for this, you know, 15 years ago, everybody was like, "Oh, WordPress is just for blogs," and the reality of that is just not true anymore at all. It's really powerful. It's really user friendly. It's flexible, and it has a huge community of developers behind it. So there's a lot going on. Some of the pros: ease of use. Again, it's a user friendly ecosystem for front end and back end users. There's a huge plugin library. The stat I read was over 50,000, which is insane. I mean, obviously some of them are done, but some of them are great. The community, again, huge developer community, and then quick iteration. We can make changes to WordPress websites really, really quickly, in most cases, and have those deployed quickly as well. I mean, you're talking about, in most cases, FTP access, to be able to make whole scale changes to WordPress sites. Some of the cons: because of its popularity, it finds itself a target for hackers. It has vulnerabilities. It's constantly updating. Anytime you see something that updates as often as WordPress does, there's reasons for that. They're not giving us features every time. It's usually security updates. It's usually to protect against new threats. Um, the speed, sometimes an issue I see a lot is developers get really, really reliant on plugins for everything, for every use case. And that can lead to really bogged down websites that use way too many plugins to do things that could be simplified and streamlined. Um, and then the customization, there's still a learning curve. If you want to do certain things, if that plugin library doesn't have that ability, sometimes you have to do things custom. So, and sometimes you're bogged down by what WordPress actually allows you to do. It has become near and dear to my heart over the last several years, starting with an original project that I worked on with Baker Hughes. I spent over a year in Drupal with Baker Hughes, and it was a lot. And so, but because of that, I've had a lot of opportunities to really get into the weeds of how Drupal works and what it's good for and what it's not. Again, it's a very powerful, flexible CMS. It does a lot of things. It does them slightly differently than WordPress does, but it's mainly centered around larger scale content. So you go from a WordPress site that really, really, really works well with like a certain amount of content to Drupal, which can handle a much larger scale of content in an easy way. So the pros: customization. It's again highly flexible for really complex websites. It also has a large module library. They call them modules in Drupal instead of plugins. So if you hear that word plugin module, it's interchangeable in terms of Drupal. The scalability, it can get big fast, and that's okay. It can handle a large, large amount of content, like Odie has. And then the community is big for Drupal as well, not quite as big as WordPress is, and their stuff can be a bit harder to find. And that's the first con, actually, is that steep learning curve. It can be a little tough because there's not quite as many developers. But and non-developers can struggle to make changes to their website in a Drupal environment. That's what we see with Odie a lot. The deployment process takes longer, not a lot longer, but it does take longer. It requires full scale deployments a lot, especially within our host. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. And then the documentation, because of the community, again, is less robust. And then Django CMS. So Django CMS, maybe a new word for you. So the underlying code is Django, and it's a Python code base. So a completely different coding language than you use for WordPress or Drupal. WordPress and Drupal are both built in PHP, JavaScript, HTML, whereas Django is built completely in Python. It's a whole other animal altogether. I put this fun fact in here. Django CMS is the only CMS on our list that doesn't have a specific dedicated backend. So it can be completely developed outside of having a sort of backend that somebody can log into and work with. That's why you end up with developers have created these backends, such as Wagtail is one that I've worked in a little bit, as well as what Rockford uses, which is mezzanine. And mezzanine was actually developed, fun bonus fact. Mezzanine was actually developed to look like WordPress on top of Django Python. So that was kind of a weird, interesting one. Pros of Django, the customization is through the roof. Python can do just about anything in the world in terms of coding at this point. So it's highly customizable. It's also very, very fast. Django is built with a don't repeat yourself mindset. And so you don't have a lot of reused code and mixed up Frankenstein code. That just doesn't happen in Python as much because it won't validate and won't work at all if you do it that way. Security is very, very strong. It's built into it, and it's extremely performant. The cons, if it wasn't already obvious, it's written in Python, which is not a thing that necessarily a lot of developers that work in other CMSs know. So it's very developer dependent. It's not something that can be easily iterated by a client, typically. Um, Also, the deployment process, even more than Drupal, is a complete deployment every single time. You have to deploy the entire website. If you want to make one change to one piece of code, you have to deploy the entire thing every time, which can become really, really cumbersome and time consuming. It also has a smaller module library. The code base is a little more tight. People don't share quite as much with Django and Python as they do with WordPress. It's Python is an open source language, but Django is not an open source backend, and so you have to kind of work with it in its own framework. So